I was talking to Will Thorndike about like what was so interesting about Henry Singleton's life and career, and it was this just wild adaptability. Like he just never held on to a strategy. Like he just adapted and updated his strategy for the prevailing conditions, and it like whiplashed around all the time. And then he did it for a very long period of time. So like the classic like don't interrupt compounding unnecessarily. And I'm really curious about how you think about that vis-a-vis Stripe when such a big part of its compounding potential like is born of your two curiosities about the world and about business and about technology, and how you make sure that it's set up in the right way so that like Stripe is the recipient of the reinvestment of your curiosity. So that like, yes, payments is probably endlessly fascinating. And maybe if you just stayed in the payments lane forever, it would be interesting enough to you both that you stick around and the business and the team benefits from your curiosity. But how do you think about that, which seems to be a common theme in technology businesses, that technologists tend to be very omni-curious, interested in a lot of things, pursue a lot of things, and there's leakage. There's like enterprise value leakage or something. And how do you think about that for 40 years hence or something, and what Stripe can become?
I think for founders, there's two kinds of curiosity that have a lot of business value or are probably important. There's also a lot of forms of curiosity that don't have particular business value, like Patrick coming to me with his latest, scheme on carbon dioxide. There was a time when, Stripe's conference room.
If it's true when we solve it, it's going to produce so much value for Stripe. How much would you pay for something that like increased, cognitive capacity at Stripe by 30%?
There was a time when all the conference rooms had carbon dioxide monitors in them, so you could monitor that. And it does get very high during a big meeting when like it feels stuffy. Like that is noticeable.
It's a real thing, yeah.
Exactly, on the CO2 detector or endocrine disruptor. So there's lots of kind of random ones. But I would say on the business curiosity front, one is absolutely, like you say, businesses are kind of different at every scale. And so Stripe has been different at, 2 people to 50 people to, currently 7,000 people. I think you have to be curious about what is required to run a good company at that stage, and kind of what's required to run Stripe well really matters. And, one thing we try to do is just spend a lot of time looking at all the other companies and what they've done. Not that you want to like blindly emulate them, but you should at least understand, it's funny, I remember Tyler Cowen commenting about Magnus Carlsen, that he entered some chess trivia contest that was just like literally about chess trivia and won it. Like he knew the most chess trivia out of anyone who was in this contest. And that's not a coincidence, I think, that the world's #1 player has also kind of studied the most about just all the chess history, and extremely knowledgeable on that. And it's a little bit on that where, like, I don't know if we'd win the business trivia, but I think we'd like have a respectable showing, because you really just have to understand like what makes like Apple versus Amazon. You cannot imagine two companies that work more differently than the two of those. One is totally functional, and one is this GM model, and yet they're both kind of really successful models. And so I think it's useful to have kind of a framework for how that stuff works. So anyway, that's one. The second is, I was actually just reading the galley for Poor Charlie's Almanac. You probably know Stripe Presses. It comes out in November. We are publishing the new...
the coolest website I've ever seen.
Well, we're really excited for Poor Charlie's Almanac, which is the coolest book. Yeah. Anyway, I was... flipping through the galley of that, and obviously he has the famous speech about the multiple mental models and just kind of cribbing the best mental models from different industries. And I do think that, I don't know if you think that every founder kind of has to do it, but I do think it's probably effective to be able to just know the top mental models from finance and from engineering and from product and from sales and stuff like that. I think that's, I don't see how you could be that effective without being pretty curious on like, how do I learn the most important mental models from this particular domain or function?
I think it's a really perceptive question. And I'd never thought kind of consciously about it before. I think there's the line about whenever you see somebody make some observation about capitalism, you should replace that with people, just because like it's the nature of just voluntary arrangements of people. And there's I guess in science, I don't know if this is true, but maybe it's true that like we've had a lot of success going down and sort of unearthing the most fundamental laws and disaggregations and decompositions, whatever. And now a lot of, we've kind of, it's not like we're fully done. There are still some unanswered questions, but I don't know, the returns to going down more seem to have diminished. It's like we've gone down pretty far.
Hadrons.
Exactly, yes. And is it hadrons or hadrons? Oh, all right, anyway. Interesting. It's, I guess one of these words you'll also see written, but then so much of science today is about sort of what you find going up and sort of combining things in different ways. And so like computer science is kind of an emergent science where like we elucidated the Turing machine or whatever almost a century ago now, but we're still finding new ways of writing interesting software, right? Or similarly with I would say biology, it's like we know how the atoms in biology work, but there are all these kind of emergent effects that start to ensue as you have cells and systems and organs and everything. With LK99, that's like an emergent effect of sort of quantum mechanics, and so like across all these different domains, AI and deep learning, like we know how the transformer works, but we're still kind of learning what the emergent effect of transformers can be. Anyway, that's all to say that I think to some extent business is just the kind of emergent effects of like volitional, voluntary arrangements of people. And that just feels like a kind of endlessly interesting thing to me. And I think Stripe is, like, I don't think of Stripe as a payments company. I think payments and commerce, all these things are really important. But for me, kind of my mental model of Stripe is an infrastructure company for facilitating, transactions and exchanges and so forth, between these different businesses, and we deliberately articulate our mission as increasing the GDP of the internet. It's not something specifically about transactions, and so I think viewed that way, just how do you have there be more businesses in the world, and how do you have those businesses be more successful? I think that's a sufficiently kind of rich vein to mine that we're not going to kind of run out of curiosity aperture in the near term.
You mentioned Apple. There's this line about Apple that I find so interesting, which is that Apple is, I can't remember who said it, but Apple is Steve Jobs with 10,000 lives, was like a line discussed about it. And that of all the major companies, like maybe it was the one where the company was a vehicle for self-expression of the founder in the most extreme way. I'm curious to what degree you think that should be the case, that like the best companies end up being vehicles of self-expression for the founders that should be preserved, not allowed to like sort of, it's an outlier to begin, and don't let it go like towards the peak of the distribution where everything's kind of normal. It's like all other businesses. So I'm curious if you agree with that idea about maybe vis-a-vis Stripe specifically, but even more generally, like should companies really just be vehicles for founder self-expression?
I think yes and no. I think yes, in the sense that I think a company should be like the resonant frequency of some tuning fork, kind of clearly rung, but and presumably the founders are chronologically the first people to respond to that wavelength. But I think it has to be. It's only going to work if it then becomes an agglomeration of people who share that idea. And to turn the Apple example around, I think it's hard to argue that Apple hasn't pretty meaningfully sustained that which Steve stood for. Yeah. And so I think a company has to stand for an idea. Yeah. But I don't think it's going to work if it's overly. I think it's going to work less well if it's overly individuated.
Another way to think about it is sometimes what people interpret as a very strong cult of a founder is just a company having a very strong culture that the founder is a metonym for. And so Apple has this extremely strong design focus, and kind of the designers are quite central in it's this very functional design, and there's probably 50, 100 designers who are kind of extremely important in all of the products that happen. And Steve was a big part of inculcating that culture, but that's a culture that can, and indeed at Apple does exist separate from that. Another example I like is Patrick and I both visited Starbase, Texas, where they're
for a launch.
No, I haven't been to a launch. I'd love to go to a launch, but this is on a non-launch day. This is before they got their.
You don't want to go to a launch until all the flying concrete is
exactly, until they figure out that part. But what really struck me is at SpaceX, and I presume as Tesla and other companies, there's obviously kind of very much the focus on kind of what is possible from an engineering point of view. And, SpaceX and, Tesla and various companies are customers. We kind of get this exposure at Stripe as well. But it's a really high agency culture. And so, for example, at Starbase, they're in the middle of nowhere, right on the border in Texas. And so they have all these issues with too many mosquitoes. So they're breeding dragonflies in paddling pools to eat the mosquitoes. And obviously there's no housing there. So they're just building their own housing, and, they need energy. So they're deploying a solar farm and everything like that. And
the guy giving us the tour at some point was who's nominally the site manager, was walking past some building. And he's like, wait, who built that?
And again, I was just very impressed by the high agency culture, which again, people associate with Elon, I think correctly, but at this point is kind of cultural with and we were asking kind of, what was the question we asked? How do you solve problems, or, who do you go to when you can't solve something? And the person we asked it of was kind of confused. They're like, well, you just figure it out and you just solve it. And so again, this wasn't something that comes from talking to Elon. This was just something that now deeply exists in the culture. And so good cultures are often, not regress to the mean. They are differentiated. They have something that, people strongly believe in, a way they strongly act, that is different from every other company. And that, again, Apple shows that it can certainly persist beyond a founder. Maybe you need a founder to get it going. I don't know.
And I think this metonym effect that John references is a huge deal. And so I think there's maybe this kind of this availability bias where we focus too much on the companies with very identifiable founders, where there aren't such convenient, memorable labels for shorthand embodiments for some of the other places like the New Yorker and the Economist. We often think about, and they have super strong cultures that have endured really powerfully.
No one can name the people.
Yeah, and maybe you can name the Economist founder, but I mean, I'm not an expert in Economist history, but it's not clear to me that there's been, particularly some kind of monotonic degradation of the culture since then. In fact, if anything, I think you can maybe make the contrary argument. So, I think it's about the idea.